episode 1.
Welcome.
I'm so thrilled. I'm so thrilled. So this is episode 1 in a part 10 series in season 1.
Of what, Todd?
Of Subject Matter X.
That's right.
So good to finally get this out there. August 1st. How's everybody doing today? Bob, how are you?
I'm great.
Yeah?
So we've been working to put this together for a little while. The whole goal is, you go to these conferences, you hear people talk. There are these experts, they're awesome, and they're larger than life.
You're so pumped up to see them.
And you're like, how do I become that person? And then they give you some bullshit excuse like, oh, I got lucky, it was great timing, and whatever. And sure, sometimes that might be accurate, but there's got to be more.
But there's more layers.
Underneath the surface, yeah.
Way more.
So what we want to do with Subject Matter X is actually peel back those layers, see what we can find, and hopefully distill some little nuggets of knowledge to throw at you guys on the other end of your iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, wherever you happen to be listening to us.
And this podcast is brought to you by ContentPair. So what we do at ContentPair is we match brands with subject matter experts, brands that need content and subject matter experts that want to share their knowledge and get their brand name out there by being published by larger, bigger brands. So if you are a business that produces content and want to be matched with somebody, or you consider yourself an expert and want to get your name and brand and knowledge out there, head over to ContentPair.com and sign up. So episode 1. Amma Marfo.
Yeah, so Amma is incredibly brilliant. She is a creative consultant, author of 3 books, speaks at conferences and facilitates workshops and trainings at colleges and universities all over the United States. Her real focused area of knowledge is creativity.
And so I know all of you are probably thinking, creativity like art and design, but that's not the case with Amma.
No.
More like
way deeper than that.
Way deeper. And we dive into not only her career path and how she got to where she is, but really her framework for how to become more creative.
And how to encourage your organization to be more creative too. Because it's sometimes not just yourself, it's the company or the school in her case, where you work. That environment really, really dictates just how flexible you can be with ideas and getting things done. So without further ado, let's bring Amma onto the podcast. Hey, Amma.
Hi, Bob.
How's it going?
I'm grand. How are you?
Grand. Grand sounds good.
Great.
I'm also grand.
This is a great day. Great day.
It is a great day. Hi, also, Todd. I didn't greet you before. How are you?
I'm good, Amma. How are you?
Still grand.
Nice. Still grand.
Still grand.
Well, we are both grand because you're on the episode.
Thank you.
This is going to be a lot of fun.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm excited about this.
Yeah, this is going to be really good. So we want to introduce you a little bit, but this is what we know about you first. We know that you are a speaker and facilitator who travels to colleges all over the country, correct?
Correct.
We know that you are a freelance writer.
Also correct.
Who do you write for?
So I write for the Women in Higher Education newsletter that's done through Wiley Publishing. I write for a comedy criticism website called The Interrobang. I've done stuff previously for Talking Points Memo, Pacific Standard, and was mentioned in The Atlantic, but did not write for them.
We know that you are a creativity consultant. Is that the right terminology?
Close enough. That's what I told my mom when she asked me what I'm doing. So yeah, we'll take it.
We know that you always have a book on yourself.
Yes, either on my phone or weighing down my backpack.
And we know that in kindergarten, you claimed to be the author of The Giving Tree.
I did. We had to write stories, and we got about the author parts on the back. I apparently said that to a kindergarten teacher who was an adult, and she did not remove it. So that was only partially my fault. I couldn't write at the time.
So we know those. What is something that we don't know about you?
I once hula hooped for 53 minutes.
Damn.
How long?
53 minutes.
Wow.
It was an episode of Nip Tuck with no commercials.
Nip Tuck.
That's how I know how long it was.
So why did you decide all of a sudden one day you're going to hula hoop?
Well, I didn't have anything to do while watching Nip Tuck, and I made it a good way through the episode without having stopped. So then I just kept going to see how long I could go. And honestly, after 53 minutes, I could have kept going. I just got bored.
So The purpose of this show is to interview subject matter experts and learn how they got to where they are and what it took for them to get there. Luck, hard work, kind of whatever goes into it. So today, Amma, we are learning about your career path and how you went from a communications major to event planning to getting your master's, and then spending some time in student affairs and taking the plunge that I think many, many people yearn for, entrepreneurship. Can we talk about that?
Let's talk about it.
All right.
So you studied communication. Let's start in college. You studied communication in college.
I did, yes.
Why communication? What did that add for you?
So if I'm being completely honest, which why wouldn't I be on a podcast? I looked at doing advertising, and I think a lot of my interest in doing advertising was because they made it look really cool on TV. So this was before Mad Men, but if anybody watched Bewitched, probably on Nick at Night by this point, Darren Stevens worked in advertising, and you got to pick things that people sold and get people to want to buy them. And I thought that was a really cool idea. So somehow that did not get deterred through most of the rest of my life. And I went into college at 17 years old, still thinking that was a good idea, and studied communications largely with the goal of wanting to do that.
And then you decided at some point to go back to school.
I did. So after college, I spent 2 years in professional event planning, one for Parks and Recreation Department in Clearwater, Florida, and then another one doing events for a community college. And when I was working at that community college, I got to do a lot of other things with students. I got to manage a building, advise student government, and I really, really liked working with students. So I decided to go back to get my master's in education, specifically to work with college students. The degree was called College Student Affairs.
I want to actually step back to being in school. You said that you really loved public speaking.
I did.
In college.
And do, yes.
And do. And I don't think many people do. So what about it do you like?
I think being able to take something that you're interested in or care about or want people to know about and find a way to articulate it in a way that they are learning or they're entertained or they're persuaded to do something. I think that's a really powerful ability. And I don't think it's something that everybody A, has, or B, likes to do. So I figure if I have it and I like to do it, then I should use it.
You graduated, you were in student affairs for 8 years, but then you had a side gig.
I did. So at any given point, I was working on more than one thing. So I had a full-time job on campuses, first at Florida State, and then I moved to Boston and was doing so at Emmanuel. And in the meantime, I was always either writing or researching and reading and all of those things. And I started hitting upon topics that not too many other people were talking about in our work. The first one, and probably the one that got me into speaking, was talking about introverts in higher education and how we build student learning opportunities, how we build educational opportunities for staff, how we promote people, how we identify leaders, and how we can put introverts into positions where they're getting to have an impact, even if they're not always putting themselves forward. And at the time, not very many other people were talking about that. So I got a lot of writing opportunities and later a lot of speaking opportunities sharing information about that.
And you wrote a book about that.
I wrote 2 books about that, yes.
What are they called?
The first one is called The Eyes Have It, Reflections on Introversion for Student Affairs, and that one was geared more towards staff. So understanding introversion, how it plays out in conferences and at work and in networking opportunities and how they can make it work for their careers. And then the second one is called Light It Up, and that one was geared towards students. So if you're working with student leaders, how can you build opportunities for them to grow and learn that take into account their temperament and what they might need?
So it was 8 years in student affairs. You're doing this on the side, and this is a side gig.
Yeah.
What's the value of side gigs to you? Do you always have one?
I try to. I think it's worthwhile to have a main thing that you're working on and then something else that can give you a break or can inform the way you're doing work in other places. And I found that in going to other campuses and talking to other people or writing for publications that had nothing to do with what I was doing, I started getting new ideas that way. So maybe there was a problem I would be stuck on at work and couldn't find a solution to. And then I would speak at an event, talk to somebody that was on a different campus, let them know what the issue was. They'd give me solutions and I could come back with a different perspective. So I always like having opportunities to do more than one thing at a time. Plus, it makes me very good with time management. And I wasn't really before. I got good at that when I got challenged. So if anybody's having trouble and has the capacity to add a thing, you might be surprised. Sometimes it makes you better instead of worse.
I mean, if you're writing a book on the side, you got to be pretty good with time management. How long did it take for you to write them?
The first one took about 10 months. I thought it would take less than that. Also, note to anybody who's planning on writing something, it will always take longer than you say to yourself it's going to take. Every single time. So I expected to be done in like 6 months. That was not realistic. It took about 10. The second one was shorter because a lot of it was reframing some of the research that had already been done. So that one was probably closer to 5 or 6 months.
And then from a career perspective, how did this help you?
It helped me because it gave me a way to stand apart from some other colleagues that I had been working with. So in student affairs, especially in the earlier years of your career, there are a lot of similar positions across the board. So everybody's jobs start to look very similar. So finding ways to stand out or stand apart or look into things that are a little bit different will help you rise a little bit into the attention of people who want to move you up a little bit further. So I got a lot of opportunities from being able to write and speak that other counterparts who maybe weren't doing those things didn't have.
And then there was something that happened that was pretty great in Baltimore, 2014, you told us?
Yes. So there's a higher education conference that's put on by an organization called NASPA, the National Association of Student Personnel Administrators. And
That is a mouthful.
It is. It is. We are not a brief people in education. We have a lot to say and we try to put it all in our acronyms. But that particular year, they introduced what they called members' choice sessions. So like most other conferences, they program them out 6 months, 8 months in advance, but they also wanted to leave space for topics people thought of closer to the conference. One of those was introversion in student affairs. And a friend of mine who had read some things that I had done and seen me speak said, I know somebody that can talk about this. So I got invited to the conference to present a session on that, made connections to a lot of people who either hadn't had that conversation before or were very glad that someone was finally talking about it. And then I started getting more opportunities to speak and to write and to share that information in new ways. So that opportunity in 2014 was a cool turning.
And then the next year, you quit everything.
I quit a lot of things, yes.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. Everything sounds really extreme. I don't mean you just kind of like up and vanished into nothingness.
I did not.
But you wound down a lot of stuff, and like why? What motivated you to do that, and what helped you actually say, "Hey, I'm going to do this"?
Well, the opportunity to do more and more speaking and more writing happened to coincide with the time that I was enjoying my work a lot less, and there were fewer parts of that job that I wanted to do. So the piece that I was always most excited about was the training and development pieces where I got to develop things that would teach students and then share them at conferences that we would do in the fall and the spring. Essentially the same kind of speaking that I'm doing now in a structured environment, but I got that 2 times a year. I got it in September and January. And as I started looking at other jobs that could capitalize on some of the experience I had, a lot of them had a lot of things that frankly I didn't want to do. And in the meantime, I was doing a lot of other things that I really liked. So I thought if I work a little bit harder on those things, then I could do that. And that would be my only job. So with that in mind, I quit my full-time job in December of 2015, went on vacation to see family, and then came back in 2016 working for myself.
So I think that's something that a lot of people resonate with, that idea of, hey, I'm in this job that I, either used to be really passionate about, or I, only kind of sort of like, but I'm burning out on what I'm doing. You said you didn't like parts of the job. You didn't really want to be doing that particular kind of work. So many people have that in their position, but they feel like, I don't know how to move into something else, either switching jobs or what I think is the dream, which is, hey, let me go do something for myself. So what was the catalyst for you? Like what helped you really make that decision? You said you went on vacation and came back and you were working for yourself, but it could not have been just like you snapped your fingers and that was that. So like what helped you get there?
Yes, you're right. It was far from that level of magic. It took a good bit of soul searching, a good bit of thinking, and a lot of research. So I talked to a lot of friends. I was lucky over the course of my work and my travels to have met a lot of people that were doing things independently. So I asked them a lot of questions. How do you make this financially feasible? How do you structure your days? How do you make sure everything's getting done? How do you make sure you have work on a consistent basis? And took all of that information and kind of internalized it really well and started to figure out what that could look like for me. So if there were ever times of year that I was working less, what would I do? Or if I ever ran into a situation where I was running low on money, what would I do? And ran through a lot of those types of scenarios. I also had a good bit of money saved, and I feel like that's very important to say. Is in a lot of ways I had some preparation under my belt. I just didn't know what it was going to be for. So once I made that decision, I had kind of a good landing pad for a little while I started to figure myself out.
How long prior to actually making that jump did you have the idea of I'm going to work for myself?
That's a good question, because I think I knew about 6 months before that at some point within the next year I was going to leave my job. I didn't know I was going to work for myself until about a month before I was actually done with my job, because I gave about a month's notice, and I think I knew the day before I gave notice that that's what I was going to do. So far less time than I would have expected of myself normally, and definitely much less time than I would advise most other people to put into it.
So 6 months of you are going to leave, change, do something different.
Right.
1 month was I'm going to work for myself.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. That sounds terrifying.
Oh, it is. It is terrifying.
Even with all of that analyzing.
Mm-hmm. I get that question a lot. People are like, wasn't it scary? I was like, was and continues to be. It's scary all the time. But being able to manage that and have processes in place and be around people that trust that I'm doing good work and can encourage me to do good work has been really helpful.
So colleges hire you to help them become more creative.
They do. I talk a lot about either how to encourage students to build in creativity to some of their experiences, or to help staff build environments where either students or fellow staff can be creative.
So let's define creativity, because I think like we've talked about this before. Is creativity to some people might mean art, might mean music, it might mean something totally different than what other people or what you are actually talking about. What's creativity to you?
For me, creativity is the idea of being able to take ideas, whether they're existing ideas or new ideas, and combine them in ways that make a difference. So it can be something that no one's ever seen before, or it could be an existing idea applied to a new scenario. But I like to make it something that feels that accessible. Do you have an idea, and where does it fit? Rather than kind of conflating it with artistry, which I feel like happens a lot. So when I talk to people and ask them if they're creative, one of the first things that always comes up is, I can't draw a straight line, or I can't draw a circle. And I don't think those things are necessarily connected. I think if you're willing to imagine an environment that looks different from the one that you're in and start to think about what that can look like, you're a creative person. And most of the time, that's really all we need, especially in those professional environments that I speak in so often.
So is it not a process-driven idea? It's more of a trait-driven idea?
I think it can be either. I like to look at it as a trait kind of idea, because then it opens up the idea that anybody has it or can cultivate it.
Your process or your idea of how people can be more creative. I'd love to let's learn a little bit more about that. I think that's super fascinating.
Let's chat about it.
So broadmindedness.
Sure. So for me, broadmindedness is the ability to recognize whatever it is you're working on can benefit from pulling ideas from all different places. So if you're an engineer, the solutions to some of your problems might be within your domain of expertise, but they might also be in education or in art or in marketing, and being open to finding multiple sources of inspiration and information. The example that I use in my book is about how Post-its came to be. And my life is pretty much held together by Post-its, so it's a story that's super important to how I work. So the inventor of Post-its originally was trying to create a glue that was super strong. And anybody that's used a Post-it knows that it does the opposite of what it was originally designed to do. So he tried it out, couldn't get the formula right, and ultimately ended up shelving it. Several years later, a different person in the company was in a church choir, and he was looking for bookmarks for the hymnals that they were using that didn't damage the pages, but also didn't fall out when you picked up the book or moved it somewhere. And he remembered that a guy in the company had done this presentation about a glue that he developed that stuck, but not so much that it would damage pages. So he got back in touch with this guy and said, can I try using that for something? And that's what it started out as. Post-its were originally bookmarks for hymnals, and then it expanded to something that they would put notes on for interoffice memos, and then they would give them to neighbors, family, friends, people that worked at other companies, and they got more and more popular. So Post-its didn't actually get started being sold until about 15 to 20 years after they were first invented. So that, to me, it represents, if you can think about the problem that you have and any number of ways you could possibly solve it, sometimes there's something like a hidden gem that you might have forgotten about or wasn't present in mind that can end up being the solution to your problem and a whole lot of other problems as well.
And a lot of organizations aren't really set up to encourage something like this. I think 3M is a really rare example of this, or maybe not really rare, but it's less common for sure. How do you encourage the people that make up that organization to have ideas like this?
I try to encourage people as they're looking at opportunities for employees to learn or grow, to let them be flexible with what they think they can benefit from. And I think the traditional mindset around that has always been, how are employees using our time? But I think also it's, what could they gain from using that time a little bit differently? And I think about one of the years that I'd wanted to go to South by Southwest for a conference that I was going to versus a more traditional higher education conference. I had to try to convince a nun in her 80s that I could learn something at South by Southwest. She did not believe me. I didn't get to go that year, but I've gone previously, I've gone since then, and it continues to be one of the better learning experiences for me for a number of different reasons. And I think being able to trust the people that work with you, to understand what they can get from an experience, and trust them to bring something back that could change the face of how they're working, that could make a really big difference.
So, for an individual who's in an organization that they feel lacks creativity, the people around them are an important catalyst for helping move that forward. So, what are they looking for in their coworkers, their colleagues, to be able to get there?
That's a good question. And as I talk to people about creativity, I really talk about it being a process that involves other people, which isn't something that we always attribute to creativity. I think we talk about specific people as icons of creativity. And with that, there's the implication that they did it by themselves. Most of the time, they don't.
We look at Steve Jobs and, ooh, Steve Jobs.
Exactly.
Icon.
But Steve Jobs had the very least one additional person around him, if not several others who have probably been erased. Mark Zuckerberg's the same way. And thinking about groups of people and what they can create for one another and how they can support each other in trying things when they're different, motivating people if things ever go wrong, being able to contribute to getting the work done if the thing they're trying to create is just too complicated for one person to do. Having collaborators is a really big part of that.
So, collaboration. What are some really good examples for you of how having these people around you that you can work with have resulted in really well executed creativity?
So I like to use comedy examples for this because I think it's more fun and it's a little bit different from how it's typically talked about. So the example I like to use is Broad City. So Abby Jacobson and Alana Glazer, the two main performers and writers for Broad City, and they started out as improv performers who were auditioning for house teams at the theater where they were training, and they kept not getting on those teams.
And I'm sorry, just for people who don't know what Broad City is, can you just give us a little bit of like what that is?
I can. So, Broad City started as a web series that these two young women, Abby and Alana, put together to test out their skills, learn how to make a web series. They mostly did it because they wanted to know how it was done, and also to explain to their parents what it was they'd been learning in improv classes, because it's kind of hard to explain if you don't see it. And they built a web series that showed them being funny, that demonstrated what they could write and how it could be executed. And a lot of people watched it on the internet. And one of those people was Amy Poehler. And she said, I think this could be really good on TV. So she decided to produce it. They took it to Comedy Central. And now it has been on, I think they're going to their final season. It's the 5th season. And that was just because it was two young women who found each other funny, wanted to help find ways to develop their own skills, but also make the other person look good. And it turned into a huge opportunity that they wouldn't have had another more powerful collaborator who served as an activator put them forward for a really big opportunity.
So you just said the word activator.
I did.
And so that's part of this broader framework of how you think about creativity.
Yes.
Um, so you say that there are different types of people that you can surround yourself with who can act in various capacities, for helping foster creativity. And so those are what? Allies, advocates, and activators.
Yes.
So you just mentioned activators, but can you talk through kind of what these three are and what that looks like?
I can. So, in addition to having collaborators who are people that tend to be on your peer level that can help you execute an idea or support you as you're working on it, allies, advocates, and activators are at a level a little bit higher. So, if there were a power differential to be described, these are people in higher positions of power. And for allies, these are the people that agree with what you're saying. So, if the people in the position to embrace your idea just need to know that somebody on a higher level agrees with you, an ally can do that. If you need an advocate who can either restate what you're trying to do in terms that are important to those decision makers or help you figure out how you need to articulate that point, that person's an advocate. They have your back, they agree with you, and they want to make sure that you can articulate it. And the activator, I think, is the highest level of that. So that's the person that they're not showing you where the door is for the next opportunity, and they're not really holding it open either. They're kicking it down and they're walking in first and they're saying, I want to help this person make this thing happen. So in the Broad City example, Amy Poehler was that activator. She knocked down the door at Comedy Central where two girls with a web series certainly wouldn't have been able to do it on their own, and said, I want to put my reputation and my money on the line to make this happen.
So this is a process that takes a lot of time, right? It's not something that happens overnight.
Right. It's definitely something that requires a lot of an individual that's choosing to take it on, or of a team that's choosing to take it on. And that comes up a lot when I'm working with especially students, but also occasionally with staff. If a student's expected to be on campus at an institution for 4 years, maybe 5 or 6, it's possible that the thing that they're working on isn't going to be done until after they graduate, and they'll get to come back and see it later on. And to have the determination to go through and do something like that, knowing you might not see the end of it, that's also a really important trait. So, how can you measure progress and celebrate small wins and think about what the end result is going to be, even if you aren't going to be there to see it? I think that's also a really important part of being creative.
So now there's another thing that comes up a lot too. It's not just a determination thing, like a willingness to keep going and not give up. But a lot of people don't start either. Like they have an idea and then it just never goes anywhere. And you call this the made for TV problem,
I do.
right?
I call it the made for TV problem because I feel like I see it a lot with things that you would sell on TV. And I used to remember watching TV with my dad and something they were selling on an infomercial, and he would say, I thought of that. And I would say, really? You thought of that? And he would say, yeah, I did. And I said, well, did you write it down? Did you tell anybody? Were there any patents? And spoiler alert, the answer is no, he did none of those things. So being that person that doesn't just have the idea, but has the, I think, capacity and ability, even if there's fear, because sometimes it is a little bit scary, to put those things forward and say, I think this is something worth pursuing, because none of this ever moves forward if nobody does that.
Yeah, so fear is a really important component because if you're afraid you're going to fail or people are going to judge you, there's any number of things that might stand in your way as a barrier. How do you encourage people to get past that stuff and just go do something?
This is one of the ones that tends to be the hardest for organizations that I talk to when I think about environments that help people be creative. So thinking about things in job descriptions that say they want people to speak up with new ideas and they're in a position where they want change makers, but maybe if those ideas don't work, that person either gets docked or they don't get pursued, or for whatever reason it otherwise harms their job progress. That's not an environment that's encouraging creativity. That's an environment that encourages it if it goes well, but doesn't really necessarily appreciate or embrace it when it goes wrong. And both of those things are part of the process. So I think about how you can lower the burden of what failure feels like, how you can normalize it, how you can praise people for trying new things even if they don't work, and being the type of organization that's flexible enough to say, all right, this version of this didn't work. What can we learn from it? And how can we move forward pursuing this differently, not just leaving it alone and saying the old way was fine.
So when you have like a new idea and you bring it to the table, how do you evaluate it?
So I think thinking about who's affected by that idea and what type of impact it could possibly have. So how could it theoretically do the greatest good, achieve what it's trying to achieve without hurting other people? So another piece of the framework that's always been really important to me is the idea of creating with heart, which is to say anybody can have an idea, but thinking about ideas that do a net good, I think that matters. I think it matters to consider ideas in terms of who could they help and who could they harm. So those are usually, that's two of the three questions that I bring about when I talk about creating with heart. Who could this idea help? Who could it possibly hurt? And how can I frame this idea in a way that maximizes help and minimizes hurt? And I think that's a piece that otherwise gets neglected, because then people are like, well, what if somebody wanted to have a creative idea and it was for something bad? And I was like, well, that's not the type of creativity I would typically advocate for. But one way to prevent that is to have a broader look at who that could affect. And I think all of the other parameters factor into that. What industries are you looking at? What populations are you looking at? And how are they interacting with the thing that you're trying to change? Who's on your team and who can point those things out early before you get too far in and have to back things up? And who in higher levels has a wider scope of what you're doing and can say, here's where you might get stuck. Consider thinking about this as that idea comes together.
So there's a popular example that happened not too long ago that actually had some backlash.
There was. It's one of my favorite examples of Twitter outrage. And I don't have many because most of the time it's just too much. But this was a good one. So, Bodega. It was two former Google employees who developed an on-demand system to deliver goods that would typically be sold at bodegas or corner stores. And the way that they phrased it that I believe caused the most ire from people that were criticizing it was they wanted to render the mom and pop store obsolete, which is a horrible thing to say. And the internet, as it does, noticed that and let them know in no uncertain terms that it was a horrible thing to say. The backlash that I saw was very specific and actually really heartwarming and heart-centered. So people were talking about how they had met people in their neighborhood that they had not met before, but ran into at the bodega on the corner and managed to make new friends and kind of meet neighbors that they had seen across the hall but never talked to. There were bodega owners that were teaching kids math by letting them help make change. Anybody who's ever met and enjoyed a bodega cat, none of those things would stick around if Bodega, the startup, had gotten the traction that it needed to actually exist. And people were speaking out, yes, in a critical fashion, but in a very specific way, saying, if you do this, this is an idea that helps you in the sense that it makes you money, but it hurts a lot of communities who use bodegas as an opportunity to gain a foothold and financial standing in a country, especially when many of those people are immigrants. So it started a really interesting conversation about what bodegas do in a number of different ways and ultimately shut down something that could have hurt a lot of people's livelihood had it gained traction.
So Bodega is a good example of what we call the Jurassic Park problem.
Yes, I love framing it like that, actually.
Which is, we can do this, but should we?
And should we do Jurassic Park? Probably not. Should we keep making the movies? That's a debatable thing that I'm not going to touch right now.
That is
but
debatable.
Some are good, some are less good. That's all I'm going to say.
All right. Amma, thank you so much for coming on the show. This was a great conversation. If people want more from you, your books, your writing, how do people find that? How do they get in touch with you?
So I am Amma Marfo on most platforms. So ammamarfo.com is my website. I'm at Amma Marfo on Twitter and Instagram. And I want to say LinkedIn as well. Yes, also on LinkedIn. So at all of those places, AMMAMARFO, and you will find me.
All right. We'll throw some links in the show notes.
Yeah, we'll have all of them there on subjectmatterx.com.
All right. And just to wrap up, one last question for you before you go.
Sure.
If people want to be more creative, what is the one thing that they should focus on?
Ooh, that's a great question. I would say a really big part of being creative and creating something new is doing something you've never done before. So talking to somebody you've never met, talking to somebody you don't think you'd have something in common with, picking up a book you might not pick up otherwise. Doing something a little bit out of your routine is the first step of trying to figure out how that could inform you doing things differently, seeing a different perspective, and letting that bleed into whatever it is you happen to be working on.
I like that. So breaking out of the comfort zone.
That is ridiculously good advice. Amma, thank you so much.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun.
And thank you for listening. If you liked this episode with Amma, head on over to iTunes. We would appreciate a rating and a review. If you'd like to connect with us on social media, we are at SMX Podcast on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. You can find us on the web at subjectmatterx.com. And you can subscribe to the podcast on your listening platform of choice. We are on iTunes, Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, SoundCloud, really like a lot of places.
Yeah. Covers the whole gamut.
Head on over, subscribe so that new episodes of Subject Matter X will come straight to the listening device of your choice.
And remember that Subject Matter X is always brought to you by ContentPair. If you are a brand and you want to produce content that is written or authored by a subject matter expert, or if you consider yourself an expert and you want to get your knowledge, brand name, you want to increase your reach, get published by a well-recognizable business blog, head over to ContentPair.com. Both of you can sign up and we will connect you with the right opportunity. So thanks for listening.
Awesome. We'll see you next week.